Good evening. This evening our lesson is a little bit different than other lessons that we normally have. And what we can say is this is kind of like a mission report. And frequently we have missionaries that come in and out of our country and provide updates on what's taking place on current works that are happening overseas. And I can recall, as even I was doing that there was some opposition to it. And I would have to call congregations and beg and plead with them just for an opportunity to have the ears of the brethren and to give them a chance, if the congregation was not going to support the work, for individuals to have an opportunity to hear. And many times our funding came from individuals, not from congregations, to send us overseas to be able to do the work that we were able to do. And so it's important. Missionary reports are important. And tonight is sort of kind of like a missionary report, but it's not. We're looking back at history that has taken place. We're going to look at one particular individual. Her name was Sarah Andrews, and we're going to look at her particular life. And she certainly, and you will see why I say, she is an example of faith, of courage, and also of resilience. And you will see that as we move through this presentation. Now, when you go to Hebrews chapter 11, we have actual biblical accounts of individuals that by faith they were prompted to action. They were prompted to engage in kingdom work, to serve God, to do whatever God had commanded them to do. And among that list of those that are there are women that are listed there, that by faith they were prompted to act. And so it's not just a list of men, but also even included in that list, there are listed not only Sarah, but Rahab. And then it lists a summary of individuals. And what's interesting is, in the midst of all of this, in our faith chapter of the Bible, in Hebrews 11, it talks about the suffering that they had to go through and how difficult it was. People were cut in two, sawn asunder. They had to survive in caves. They were running. They were persecuted. And it talks about how challenging and how difficult it was during those individuals' lives. And actually, we could say, as Paul is the author, whoever the author of Hebrews is, some would assume that it is Paul. But the author of Hebrews, and as he's writing, he talks about how challenging it was. And he mentions several. And he basically says, I don't even have enough time to even begin to talk about, and he throws out a few individuals. But then he moves on at the very end where it talks about the summary of exploits. It talks about all those things that are quite exciting. We would say it's very action-packed as you move at the end of the book of Hebrews, and how difficult it was for many individuals and how their faith helped them to persevere. And so what we'll say at the beginning of this lesson as we move forward is, it takes every hand. I realized that when I was overseas and doing mission work, we would go out and we would do this or that. And for example, we worked really hard to translate one particular work into Swahili, but it was the work of another man. It was the work of another missionary, J.C. Choate. And so we had permission by Sister Betty Choate to translate it into Swahili. We translated it. We got it into print. Then we distributed it. But then it got into the hands of Christians. So it left us. So we took somebody else's work that they had worked very hard on, used it all over in Asia especially, and then put it into Africa and started to distribute it. And then the brethren took over. And then the brethren then gave that to one particular man that I'm thinking of in one village. He studied it. He said, I want to obey the gospel. He called one of the guys that I was working with. He said, I want to obey the gospel. I've read this entire book and I'm ready to become a Christian. He said, well, let us travel down there. So they made a trip down there. They studied with him, and he happened to be a prominent political figure, very well known. He called his employees and said, you guys need to be here. You need to hear this. And he was calling everybody he knew, and so they gathered a whole bunch of people. And they baptized a big group of people. But it started with that man receiving the material, digesting it, understanding it. Then he reached out. And so, when you see that trickle of one gentleman that worked, and he was supported to do the work, and he did the work, and he put the material in writing, and then I was able to get a hold of it many, many years later after he's already passed. And then we work to translate it, and then we get it to Christians, and then Christians take it. And then they give it to a non-Christian. A non-Christian gets it. He reads it, and then he gathers all the non-Christians together, and then all of a sudden, you've got all of these different people. We gathered people to go and study with this large group from Chamala Mission, from Andrew Conley School of Preaching Mission, in Arusha and all of these different areas. And so you had preachers coming from all of these different areas. They came together, they studied with those people, and souls were saved. Congregation was started. So what I say by that is when it comes to evangelism, as we look right here in our congregation, in our community, it takes every single hand. I know when Rob Whitaker came, we had the evangelism seminar. He talked about that there are bringers, there are teachers, there's all these different areas in which we have different people that perform different functions. And as we study about Sarah Andrews, we'll find out that she filled a lot of those roles, but especially she was a bringer. And so we have to have evangelistic parents that put that as a priority, and it does make a difference, and we're going to see that as we study through this lesson. We're going to see that we need to allow missionaries to be able to come in and to report, though some people think, oh, it's boring, or oh, I'm going to go somewhere else where I can actually worship. No, it is worship. It is important. It is significant, and we'll drive that home as we move through the lesson. But missionary influence is important. That's how we get the next generation of missionaries to grow up and want to go and do those things, to inspire them, to encourage them. And then converts, sharing the gospel with others is so vital. It's very significant. It's so important for us to make sure that we share the gospel with others. So let me tell you a little bit about Sarah Andrews. Some of this is going to be history, and it is history. And so she was born in Dixon, Tennessee. So it's not terribly far from us, a couple of hours north. And she was born in the early 1890s. And so I was trying to wrap my head around all of this, and even in the time frame of when she ended up going overseas. And that was before Brother Tootin, as was mentioned just a few hours ago. That was before he was even born. So sometimes I was trying to get a grasp of how far back this goes, and it goes back a pretty good distance. And so she was born in the early 1890s, and her family lived about 25 miles from the nearest congregation. And so what they did is that family, her parents, actually worked to start a congregation in their community. And so because of that, then you've got a child who was able to watch evangelistic parents working in that way and trying to spread the gospel and reach others and starting a congregation right there in their community. And that had an impact upon her, as we will see. So at a young age of 12, she met a female missionary that was a missionary to Japan. Now, remember, the great, what we would say is the great split. I think it was the census of 1906 when they reported that there had been a division of the Christian Church, the Disciples of Christ, and the Church of Christ. There had been a split over instrumental music and missionary society and other things. And so this is actually prior to that, when she would have met this lady, Kate Johnson, and had learned about this woman who was a single woman who was working over in Japan while she was on furlough. And so the parents of Sarah Andrews helped organize a protracted meeting in 1891. And what that did was that started the congregation at Walnut Street. It's actually Walnut Street Church of Christ in Dixon, Tennessee. So the congregation was not there prior to that. And so the parents worked to try to bring in I.B. Bradley to preach a meeting. And so he did, and then later on he ended up working with that congregation from 1905 to 1917 in Dixon, Tennessee. But again, it goes back to the influence of parents and how those children are watching and how much of a difference it can make on those that follow. And so we need to be making sure that we are setting the appropriate example as parents as we bring them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. What is our priority? What is important? And so she was baptized in 1906 by I.B. Bradley at the age of 14. And so having learned the missionary endeavors of J.M. and Della McCaleb in Japan, and actually getting to hear Brother McCaleb speak in Dixon, Tennessee in 1904 about his work that he was doing in Japan, young Sarah began dreaming about going over to Japan. Now, J.M. McCaleb was a missionary to Japan. He wrote what we just sang, "The gospel is for all." And so when we sing that, don't say the heathen are only at home, beyond we have no call. Why should we be blessed alone? The gospel is for all. The whole point is he had heard the same thing I had heard when raising support We need to be working here. Forget those people everywhere else. Well, no, we do need to be working here, and we need to be working everywhere. The gospel needs to go everywhere. It needs to go into our communities. It needs to go into our state, and it needs to go overseas as well. And so that's this gentleman who actually was a missionary to Japan came and did a missionary report. And this young girl heard that missionary report. She's already met one woman that was single that went to Japan. She heard this faithful gospel preacher, J.M. McCaleb, come and present about his work that he was doing in Japan. And so that inspired her. She was just a little, just a teen when she heard those missionary reports. And you think about that and you say, well, we ought like to overlook that. We think those missionary reports are not important. But think about that young person, that teen who heard that and then decided, you know what? That's what I want to do. She set out exactly to do that. And so she actually wrote him when she was very young and said, you know what? I want to come over there and work. And he just wrote back because he didn't think much about it. Wrote back, well, get your education, and kind of prepare for that. And so, well, she took it seriously, and she did. And so she graduated from Dixon's Normal College with a certificate in teaching. So she was an educator. She took additional classes at the State College in Memphis and David Lipscomb College in Nashville. At the age of 22, she wrote J.M. McCaleb and said, I'm ready. So, it started, at 12, there was some interest. At 14, around that time, she was able to hear J.M. McCaleb with a presentation. That's what I want to do. She set out to do it, and that's exactly what she did. She said, you know what, I'm ready for you to announce in your paper. And that's actually a picture of the Christian Leader, which is the paper that they put out. I want you to announce in there that I'm ready to go to Japan this fall. And so this is cited from it. I'm just going to read it. It seems to me that the arrangement indicated is just as the Lord would have it in every respect. Our sister commended, sent forward to the foreign field, and supported by the church where she has been born and brought up. And so, interestingly enough, she actually was supported by a whole bunch of individuals. Majority of those that actually supported her were by individuals that were there from her congregation in Dixon, Tennessee, to send her over to do this work. And so, the leader also carried a recommendation by the preacher, who her family, her parents had brought in to start the congregation in Dixon, Tennessee, I.B. Bradley. He said this, she is enthusiastic over the prospects of going to Japan and to the work. I think she is dependable and will make an earnest, zealous worker. I have been interested in her for 10 years, ever since I've been with the church at Dixon. I baptized her, have watched her develop, and noted with delight her zeal and earnestness, as well as her loyalty to the Lord's revealed will and way. And so that was his recommendation put in this particular paper. And you can notice the date 1915. So that gives you a little bit of a time frame. And so some might question what type of work a single woman would be able to do. And so she actually addresses this. We'll say at the outset that I expect with God's help to continue to remain within the bounds of woman's realm as clearly taught in the New Testament. So she started off as she's writing in this paper to say, now, by the way, I want to go on and do this work, but I intend to stay within the biblical realms of where I belong as a woman. I'm not planning on stepping outside of that and usurping authority over the men in this work. And so she set that as the outset. She said this, if God permit, I expect to care for the sick. So what kind of work was she going to be doing? Care for the sick, give to the poor, help the heavy laden, weary and oppressed, teach in the school if Brother McCaleb desires. In fact, do anything by which some may come to the knowledge of the truth. Is there a better way of teaching humanity than by becoming a servant to all? True happiness comes through helping others. In Japan alone, there are 40 million who have never heard of Christ as Savior of mankind. Hence, there is plenty of work to be accomplished. In many respects, women's place in the church cannot be filled by man. And we would agree with that. That's why when you look at the qualifications of elders and of deacons, they have the women that are there associated with them. They have to be married, husband of one wife. And so that is part of the qualification. And so she set sail Christmas Day 1950 from San Francisco, and then she landed in Tokyo, Japan in January of 1916. And so here's a rough map, and can you try to imagine that? 1916. We have a lot of conveniences, so if we go over to Japan right now, it's a total different ball game, especially Tokyo, landing in Tokyo, with all of the modern conveniences and everything that's there. But try to take yourself back to around the time of World War I, and then, how different it would have been in her going over to a place such as this. Sarah's first years on the mission field were spent in Tokyo. She had to learn Japanese, and then she spent that time teaching English Bible classes, and then she was trying to learn about the people, and I understand that. Going to a place where you're not familiar with the culture and you're not familiar with the religious practices, it can be a challenge to kind of know what's going on, know what the cultural norms are, and so she had to spend some time there. History records for us that she had a lot of problems with her health. Matter of fact, if you go back and read of all of the early missionaries that went to Japan, almost all of them suffered the same fate. And many of them didn't last very long. A lot of them came over and had to go right back and come back to the United States because it was tough. The conditions were harsh. The weather is different and the environment very different. And so a lot of people struggled to be able to go into a work like that. Now, in my mind, I'm not thinking Japan, that would be tough. But it was. It was very challenging. And so, she, during this time, dedicated a significant amount of time. It's very hard for us to imagine moving to a place where nobody speaks English. And then the only way you're going to communicate is if you speak their language. And that's hard. It is very stressful. It's very taxing. Because now the burden upon you is to just dig in and learn a language. Now, there are some languages that are easier to learn than others. Japanese, especially writing, and that the alphabet is not our alphabet. It's a harder language to learn. So there was a significant struggle for her to be able to do so. And so even it is recorded in history due to her health problems that David Lipscomb's wife, Margaret, gave Sarah a hot water bottle, and then later on down the road helped her to raise funds so she could live in a more Western-style home so that she would not have to suffer as much. What did she do while she's there? Well, she taught cooking and sewing to neighborhood women and children. She helped them learn about Jesus. As the years passed, the kids became teenagers. They were baptized, and then along with some of the mothers and fathers. And so it gives us a little bit of an idea of what her work was like. Among those baptized in her first year in Japan, this is one of them, this young lady. And actually, she was one of her first converts, and she stayed by her side. And I'm sure that helped with her early on in language training, but she actually went, when Sarah transitioned to different villages to work and to do the work, this woman, we'll call her Icky, she was the one that was by her side and became a fellow worker with her. And she gave her the name Bible Woman because of her devotion to the work. In 1919, Sarah, along with Icky and her mother, who had also been baptized, decided to begin work in a different place. Now, this place, I show you this on Google Maps, is what this is. And you can see where they were. You can see there's Tokyo, and that kind of gives you an idea where Japan is and where they were located. So here is Tokyo, and they decided to move from Tokyo then to this city, Okitsu. And so that's where they moved for their first work. And what did they do? They opened up a kindergarten from which a large Bible school developed. And after time, they solicited help from an evangelist. Now, this man was a Japanese man who had lived in the United States. He'd lived in Michigan. He was converted in Michigan and then returned to work in Japan. And we find that to be common. So, when we're here in the United States, we think, well, those foreigners need to go home. I've heard a lot of bad attitudes many times with even those that speak Spanish. Well, we don't need to evangelize them. They need to learn English. Well, we could all have varied opinions on that. But until then, shouldn't we teach them in Spanish so that they can know Christ and be saved? Should we be more concerned about their soul than the language that they know right now? So, you think about that, and we have individuals here that potentially may go back to their homeland. We can teach them the gospel of Christ, and if they do go back, Think of the impact. Think about it if they obey the gospel here, and they may correspond with their family back home and convert them back home, and how much of a difference that can make. And so even here, if you never even leave the United States of America, you can still have an international impact from that standpoint. And so that's what happened with this gentleman who was converted. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 2, and the things that thou hast learned, that thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men. That actually is the generic word for people, not just males. Commit thou to faithful people who shall be able to teach others also. And so we entrust the gospel to individuals so that they then can share it to others. And so this particular gentleman, I'm going to call him Fujimori, and I hope I don't botch the name, but that's the way I would pronounce it. Fujimori was a young Japanese businessman in Detroit, Michigan. He was befriended and taught the gospel by Frederick A. Wagner. And in 1898, they both founded a mission colony in Japan, started a school, orphans' home, home for the elderly, a small congregation, and 6 preaching stations. But later on, Wagner died of illness in 1901. But you've got this Japanese gentleman who was converted to Christ, who continued on the work. And so when Sarah Andrews then came to Japan, then they worked together. And what Sarah did was she would make relationships. She would teach the women. She would actually have Bible classes with the women, with the children, and she's teaching them. She's forming relationships, and then she would invite them into her home, and then she would invite Fujimori to come over and to preach. And so he would come and preach, and she was a bringer. And she brought those individuals into her home, and that gospel preacher would get up and preach, and souls were saved. And so that's exactly ultimately what this slide shows. And so that's an actual picture of Fujimori, which I think is pretty neat. I was able to pull some of this information offline. And so after the work in Okitsu was established, Sarah decided that she was going to move to another location. They opened a children's school, Bible school, and they began to help plan another congregation. So you can see over here to the right where she was, and then they went actually on the other side of Tokyo to a different bay, and there was a couple of different locations where they worked around that one particular bay in which they were trying to establish. And you can see that there were actually 3 different areas there where congregations were established. Now for me, I could only find 2 of them on Google Maps. Some of the names sometimes change a little bit over time, and you could even see that, but I was able to at least locate those 2. And so Sarah writes this from the Gospel Advocate in 1927. Some folks may think and talk of being in Japan as a sacrifice, but to me, leaving is a supreme sacrifice. And so she, a lot of people from the United States that think, oh man, it's so hard. And it was a challenge for her. No doubt she struggled with her health, with conditions. It was very hard. But she said actually for her, it wasn't a sacrifice to actually be over there and to serve the people. It would be a greater sacrifice for her to leave because she knew that there were lost souls and she wanted to make a difference. And so in the late 1930s, there was another problem that came over, and that was the prospect of war in Europe and Asia. And so the American consulate advised all American citizens to return home. J.M. McCaleb, who had been in Japan since 1892, returned home the fall of 1941. And of course, you can imagine World War II had already was on the verge of taking place and opening up as World War II. And so already war was raging in Europe, and they evacuated everybody from the consulate. Here's another picture. This is actually a picture of Sarah Andrews. And so despite the advice of McCaleb and pleadings from Japan, she stayed. She said this, and she's quoted as saying this: I'm just as near heaven in Japan as in the United States. And so, it makes sense. It didn't really matter where you die. You're just as close to heaven from there. It could be in Africa or anywhere else. And I know the gentleman that I work with, John Strong, he had that basic opinion. He was like, if I die over here in Africa, so be it. That's okay with me. He said, you just send my ashes home. If they want them back home, you can send them home, and send my LSU cap. I said, brother, I don't know that I can send the LSU cap, but, I'll send your ashes back home. But, I've known of people like that they were okay. If that's where they were going to die, that was fine. It didn't matter to them. In 1 John chapter 4, 17 through 19, it says, "Herein is our love made perfect, whole, complete, that we may have boldness in the day of judgment, because as He is, so are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casteth out fear, because fear hath torment. He that feareth is not made perfect in love or complete in love. We love Him because He first loved us." When you are a Christian, then ultimately you know that you're right with God. You know you have the forgiveness of sins. You have blessed assurance in Jesus Christ. And because of that, then you do not fear the day of judgment. You do not fear the torments of hell as an individual who's not right with God, but a person who's walking in the light, who is right with God, has that comfort. As war grew closer, American assets were frozen in the country, in Japan. Foreign Postal Service stopped in Japan, and this is what she recorded. She said, "I sold my furniture piece by piece in order to buy food. All enemy property was held by the finance department as confiscatable. Hence, to obtain permission to use any of it required excessive official routine or red tapery." Now, as I'm going through this, my mind also jumps over, and I'm thinking of these Christians in Ukraine in some ways, and those that are there, and how challenging it is, and what they're going through. And here you have an individual who's going through similar things, where she was in a country that was under siege. "I was required to get permission to sell each piece of furniture, then permission again to use the money. Although the amount I was permitted each month was only a pittance, it was sufficient to pay for my rations, because food and all commodities were scarce." And so Sarah was concerned that if she left the country, that Japanese government would seize the property. They would force Christians into government-controlled state church. And she was afraid of that, and so she didn't want to leave so that all the property would be snatched up by the government. And guess what? That's exactly what they tried to do. They tried to come in and snatch up the property because they wanted the titles to everything. They wanted to take all the church property, and she wouldn't do it. And she was put into a concentration camp there in Japan because she would not turn over the titles and the property that belonged to the Lord's church. She was imprisoned in 1942. The Japanese government reportedly sent Sarah to a concentration camp. And because of the damp conditions and the starvation diet, she contracted tuberculosis. They admitted her to a sanitarium and then placed her in solitary confinement on a houseboat, and then confined her to house arrest, where she was sent to her home to die. And so ultimately, that's the chain of events. She suffered so much in her concentration camp. She contracted this terrible illness, and they didn't want her around everybody else, and so they decided they were going to send her, and the only way to do that was to confine her in solitary confinement, and ultimately that ended up being in her home, where they expected her to die. She wrote this: "I have never experienced hunger until I was caught in the throes of war and famine as an enemy national during this war. My weight reached the low ebb of 75 pounds, and my body became very anemic from malnutrition. In desperation, I boiled leaves from the trees for food, boiled and used water from corn stalks for sugar, used seawater for salt, and after months of meatless days, I relished grasshoppers for meat, wishing I could have the same dish often." So that was the extent of where she was. She was left to die in her home. She was not in a good condition, and this was where her health was taking her. Surviving the starvation, Sarah also had to face the threat of bombings. Now, if you studied history and you know about World War II and you understand about the things that took place there, then you'll understand that we needed to send a message to stop the war, and it was effective. It stopped the war. But in order to do that, before the big bombs were dropped, we dropped a significant bombing there in Tokyo and all the surrounding areas, which would have been where she was located. And so she was there in the midst of all of these things in her home. And so you have the air raid in July 1945. The little chapel that was there was destroyed. She was sleeping in her home across from the chapel and didn't know anything of the destruction until she awoke the next morning. Part of that could be her poor health and the situation that she was in. This picture is actually taken not from where her house was. This is just a picture from an area after some of the bombing. And it was taken sort of kind of near the area in Japan where she was staying. July 1945, near the end of the war, the city was bombed where she slept. The entire area was devastated. And this was the reports that were given, and this is the record we have. The only house left standing was hers. Now, if you believe in divine providence, then you can put that there. But she survived amidst bombing you cannot imagine. If you go back and you look at the images that were before and after, you cannot even believe. And she survived. Then one day the bombing stopped. A neighbor came over, told her the war was over. And for nearly 3 years, there was no communication while all this was going on during the war between Sarah and her family. And her family, her sister lived in Tyler, Texas, and regularly had men that were in the Air Force and other armed branches of the United States military to come over to eat. And as she would bring them over, she would beg them, if you get over there and you get near where she lives, will you go look for her, see if she's okay? So her sister was constantly doing that. And finally, MacArthur entered Tokyo along with the force that was able to free them, and a Christian member of the church, soldier, and 2 other gentlemen that was with him took a Jeep, traveled 70 miles over, found her. She was weighing 75 pounds, near death. And then the soldiers left their rations and took off back to Tokyo, came back with a bunch of groceries and supplies, ultimately saving her life. And so, her condition had to have been really dire. I mean, they left everything they had and they took off and then they came right back. She was not in a good way. And they left and came back with blankets and food and with their Jeep loaded. And so she returned to the States in 1946 to convalesce, but she wanted to be back. She wrote why, because you're thinking, why would anybody? Why would anybody go back? And let's be honest, I want you to think about it seriously. What was the attitude of Americans at this time in 1946 toward those individuals living in Japan? And probably some in this audience could admit it wasn't good, maybe even your own, because of what happened at Pearl Harbor, because of the war. And rightfully so, there were some things that would trouble many Americans. But for her, she had been working there prior to all of that happening, prior to the poor decisions that were made by leaders that caused so much torment. And this is what she said: for a century, Japan has been the foremost nation in the Orient. The aspirations that led to the war was to form a greater East Asia, it being the big brother, but it failed. This dream was worldly, without God. Defeated Japan still has the talent of leadership, however, and we should help it to the point where it can use it for the good of its neighbors. To give Japan the gospel is the answer to its greatest need and service to others. I can't think of a more profound statement to be made in 1947, coming from an American after all of the events. Because I can assure you, most wouldn't have had that. It would be hard, and I'm not saying it, I'm just saying it would have been extremely hard, to be honest with you, to look past the events and to look past the war and to see souls. But she was able to do so, and she knew, and we all know, the greatest at present in our situation, the greatest need for all countries is the gospel. The greatest need for Russia, and you can put any other country in there, the greatest need is the gospel of Jesus Christ. After years of recovery, she returned to Japan. This is actually a picture of her and Ikki. And so she returned to Japan. In addition to her work with churches, she opened a rest home for Japanese women whose sons and husbands had been killed in the war. She was a very compassionate lady. The minister for the welfare department in the area in which she lived gave his assistance to help even make that home a reality. Believed so much in what a foreigner was doing in the country that they were willing to get behind that. And so Sarah also invited American Christians to support this particular work during this time. While at home in 1958 on furlough, with only 3 years left before she passed away, her family begged her to stay. She was on furlough. She's in the U.S. Please stay. Don't go back. And she said this, and she was in Tennessee with her family. It's as near to heaven from Japan as it is from Tennessee. And so she went back. She continued to teach Jesus to the Japanese for another 15 years after the war. She died from a second stroke. She had had a stroke. She died from a second stroke on September 17, 1962. And she is buried in Japan. Fellow Christians placed a large marble marker at her tomb. And matter of fact, some of the orphans that she helped, one in particular, was adamant and made sure that there was a tombstone and that marble place marker put there for her to represent all that she had done. You think about a kid, 12 years old, 14 years old, hearing some mission report and says, that's where I want to be. And who would have ever thought that they would do it? I mean, how many of us said, I want to be an astronaut when I grow up, right? How many of us are astronauts? I want to be a rocket scientist, But here's somebody that says, this is what I want to do. She had enough dedication, resilience to just stick to that plan. She did it. And she didn't give up. And in the midst of horrendous times, she continued to persevere. She did not give up on her faith. How many people in situations like that would just turn their back on God? Would start to blame God, would get confused in all the politics and start allowing politics to overtake their Christianity. It's hard. I think about the history that happened here. I'm telling you right now, it's hard. That's why I'm so impressed with what this person, what she stood for is right. It's absolutely right. Those individuals need the gospel. But I keep thinking back about the events in history, and it's hard to overcome hatred, and it's hard to overcome bitterness, and it's hard to overcome those things and those feelings. She was willing to do, and did do that. So much so that she was willing to go back, even to the people that dropped those bombs at Pearl Harbor. We hate the memory of that day. We despise that. We can't stand the memory of those poor, innocent individuals that died on that day. And yet their families need the gospel. Maybe if they'd had the gospel, they wouldn't have done that in the first place. So we have to look beyond all of that to see souls. In our life today, we have to do the same thing. We have to be willing to look past things that are right there in front of us that might hinder us, and then pull that aside and think about somebody's soul. The monument erected by both Christians and non-Christians inscribed with these words, she dedicated her whole life to her beloved Japan and Japanese people. She taught and trained many believers in Jesus Christ and gave all the glory to God. When she knew it was her time to leave, she recited Psalm 23 for hours, which moved those attending her deathbed to tears, reciting it over and over again. When she said she was going over, she only intended to go over some 5-7 years. She ended up staying 46 years. 46 years. She's attributed to helping establish around 8 congregations in Japan. And why is that important? Well, if you've ever seen the Japanese flag and you understand how they revere their emperor at that time, how they revere their leader and think that he's deity, that they needed the gospel. That they needed to know about the one true God. They needed that information, and so she was there to try to help. to the best of her ability. So what do we gain from some unusual lesson is this? Different, probably, than you've heard, maybe ever, I don't know. Definitely different than what you've heard from me. What do we walk away from studying about an individual who had courage, faith, resilience? What do we take away? Number one, are evangelistic parents important? You say, you look at her life, look what she did. I mean, look what she accomplished and all the people that she touched with the gospel. As a woman who's not able to stand in the same places as a man is and to go out and do as much, she had certain restrictions placed on her by the New Testament, by God. And so there are certain limitations. She stayed within her limitations and still made a significant difference. And you think about that. Are evangelistic parents important? They certainly are. Because of that influence, think about how much it impacted this one person and then what she was able to accomplish in her life. Are missionary reports important? I've had so many people tell me, no, they're not. You know, you can go to the Bible and you can read about missionary reports. Matter of fact, you can read about missionary journeys. I mean, if you study the book of Acts, isn't that what you're studying? About missionaries and what they did and where they went. And why do we have listed all these cities? And why do we have to know that he went to this port and there was a storm out at sea and it tossed him back and forth and then he had to make land here and then he went over there? And why do we know that? By inspiration, we know it. Must have been important enough to put there. It's there for a reason. Because missionary reports are important. They are significant. They help us to understand what it takes to share the gospel in different places. It gives us an appreciation for the fact that there are souls that are starving for the gospel everywhere. And so when we see the work that's being done and we see souls being reached, maybe in Japan, maybe in Africa, maybe in India, when we see that, we get excited. And then we open up our eyes and say, you know what? There are souls right here, that need the gospel, and it encourages us to want to become more active. Matter of fact, when you look at Acts chapter 14, you read there, it says, and thence sailed to Antioch, and from whence they had been recommended to the grace of God for the work which they had fulfilled. And when they were come, they had gathered the church together, they rehearsed, that is, they reported, they declared all that God had done with them, and how He had opened the door of faith unto the Gentiles. He gathered the church together and gave a missionary report to let them know how God was working great things for the Gentile people. And so it is biblical. We do see the pattern of that. Though this is a very different missionary report because it's a historical missionary report. It's reporting of what happened and work that was done in the past. It encourages us, inspires us to say, man, if that person can do that, I can make a difference. You say, well, can one person make a difference? And one young lady, could she ever make a difference? The answer is yes. Can I make a difference as just one person? Well, absolutely, you can. I mean, that's evidence through the Scriptures, but it's evidence also in the life of this one. It takes every hand to help the church grow. Every hand. It takes parents who encourage the evangelistic spirit, that show and pave the way, that show that this is important. Souls are important. It takes missionary influence. J.M. McCaleb wrote The Gospel is for All. We sing it all the time. Came around, gave a missionary report, and this little girl sitting in the audience, she said, I want to go to Japan. J.M. McCaleb thought, I hear that all the time. A few years later, he realized, no, she was serious. And think of all the good that was done. Converts need to share the gospel with others. When we obey the gospel and we're new converts, maybe sometimes we think, well, I'm a Christian now, and I don't have anything else to do. But really, the work has just begun.
So as a new convert, we have an opportunity then to reach out to the people around us. We've just received good news, and it's new news to us. We didn't know it before, now we have it, and we understand it enough to obey it. And so, man, there's people around us that we know, they haven't heard this. They need to know. And so we have an opportunity then to reach out to those that are around us and to share with them the good news. Tonight, if you're not a Christian, will you obey the gospel of Christ? The gospel is for all. Jesus died on the cross for all. Will you come to Him? Will you believe that He is the Savior, the Son of the living God, the Messiah, the chosen one? Will you believe that? Will you confess that with your lips? Romans chapter 10 and verse 10. Will you turn away from your past sins in repentance? And will you be baptized so that your sins can be washed away, Acts 22:16, to rise to walk in a new life, having put on Christ in baptism, Galatians chapter 3 and verse 27. You can do that tonight. Maybe as a Christian you realize you haven't been doing what you need to do. You've allowed Satan to distract you, to turn you away from the path that you know you need to be on, and you want to come home. You can do so. As we reflect upon the life of this one, man, I see courage. Somebody's going to stay. We're about to be bombed. I think I'm going to stay. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I would have stayed. I'm not just speaking for myself. I mean, that's courage. You're sick. You're struck. I'm going to go back. Those people hate us. They bombed. I'm going back. She went back. Take the gospel to people that needed it. If she was willing to do that, what are you willing to do? What am I willing to do? What are we willing to do to make a difference for Christ? Won't you come? Together we stand and as we sing.